He paid $40 for the girl in front of half the town. But it was the question she asked him that night that nearly brought the toughest cowboy in Red Hollow to his knees. The wind came hard across the flatlands of West Texas, dragging dust through the crooked streets and rattling the loose shutters of dying storefronts. And Caleb Turner rode into town the way he always did. Quiet, straight-backed, eyes forward. A man who had long ago decided that speaking less meant hurting less. Red Hollow wasn't much anymore, just a scatter of sun-bleached buildings crouched against the endless plains. But it was the closest thing to civilization within 20 miles of his spread, and once a month he made the ride for flour, salt pork, lamp oil, coffee, and whatever else he could strap behind his saddle. He had built his cabin himself 5 years earlier after fever swept through his home, and took his wife Hannah and their little boy Micah in the span of 6 merciless days. And since lowering 2 pine boxes in a hard winter ground, Caleb had chosen solitude over everything else because solitude did not laugh, did not leave, and did not die. Folks in Red Hollow knew better than to bother him. He paid in cash, nodded when spoken to, and left without lingering, the kind of man who carried grief like a second shadow and wore it without complaint. That afternoon the sky was a harsh white blue, the sun sharp as a blade, and Caleb tied his horse outside Dugan's Mercantile, finished his buying in 10 clipped minutes, and would have ridden out again if not for the shouting that broke loose near the Silver Spur Saloon, a slurred voice rising above the clink of bottles and the lazy out-of-tune piano drifting from inside. $40, the man yelled. 40, and she's yours. At first Caleb did not turn. Men sold saddles, rifles, sometimes even land when whiskey hollowed out their scents, and it wasn't his business. But then he heard another word carried clear through the wind, girl, and something inside him tightened like a cinched rope pulled too far. He turned slowly and saw Walter Briggs swaying in the dirt street, hat tipped back, eyes glassy with drink and desperation, his shirt hanging loose on a body worn thin by drought and poor harvest, and beside him stood a child no more than 9, maybe 10 at most, her brown hair tangled around a narrow face, dress faded to the color of dust, boots scuffed and too large for her feet. She did not cry. She did not protest. She simply stood with her hands folded tight in front of her, staring at the ground as if hoping to disappear into it. She can cook, she can clean, she can tend chickens, Walter insisted to the small knot of men pretending not to look. I need a horse. Can't work my claim without one. Someone muttered. That's her daughter. But no one stepped forward. No one reached for the girl's hand, and the silence of bystanders cut deeper than the shouting ever could. Caleb felt the past surge up without warning. Remembered being a boy himself, powerless and frozen as his own sister had been handed over to a gambler to settle a debt. Remembered her terrified eyes searching for him, as if he might do something, anything, and remembered doing nothing at all. Years later he had found her in a border town south of San Antonio, broken and sick, dead before she saw 20 winters. He had carried that failure like a brand burned into bone, and standing in Red Hollow's dusty street, watching another child bartered in daylight, while decent men stared at their boots, he felt that old shame rise hot and choking in his throat. $40, Walter repeated, voice cracking now, whether from drink or guilt Caleb could not tell. The girl swayed slightly in the wind, but still she did not look up. Caleb's hand moved before his mind caught up with it. He stepped forward, boots heavy against packed earth, and the small crowd shifted as if a storm had rolled in. I'll pay it, he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Walter blinked as though he had not expected anyone to answer. You, he slurred. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out folded bills, money meant for winter feed and repairs, and counted them slowly so there would be no mistake. 40, he repeated. For a heartbeat the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Walter grabbed the cash with trembling fingers, stuffed it into his pocket, and shoved the girl forward without ceremony. She's yours, he said, already turning away, already looking toward the saloon doors as if whiskey might erase what he had done. He did not kneel. He did not say goodbye. He did not touch her shoulder. He walked away. The girl stumbled but caught herself, still silent, still staring at the ground. Caleb found himself facing her with no plan beyond the sudden, fierce certainty that he would not watch another child be traded like livestock and walk away unchanged. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. After a long moment, she answered without lifting her head. "Lily." Her voice was barely more than wind for grass. Caleb nodded once, unsure if she saw it. "All right, Lily," he said, trying to steady the rough edge in his throat. "You're coming with me." He half expected her to resist, to run, to scream, but she simply followed as he led her to his horse, the men of Red Hollow parting to let them pass, their faces unreadable, some ashamed, some indifferent, some perhaps relieved that someone else had acted so they would not have to. Caleb lifted her easily into the saddle before him. She was shockingly light, as if hardship had already carved away the weight childhood should have carried. As he swung up behind her and took the reins, he felt the small stiffness in her back, the way she held herself braced for something worse than being sold, and he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that buying her was only the beginning of a story he did not yet understand. He nudged his horse forward, leaving Red Hollow and its dusty judgment behind, the town shrinking in the distance while the plains opened wide and merciless ahead of them. And though he had spent years convincing himself that he was finished with love, finished with family, finished with the kind of risk that left a man shattered, he could not shake the feeling that the $40 he had just paid would cost him far more than money before the sun set again. She didn't cry when Caleb brought her into the cabin, but the way she watched every movement told him she believed the worst was still ahead. The ride from Red Hollow had been quiet, the prairie stretching wide and empty around them, Lily sitting stiff in front of him in the saddle, small hands gripping tight, as though she expected to be thrown aside at any moment. When they reached his spread, a plain timber cabin, a weathered barn, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, Caleb lifted her down carefully, setting her on the porch like something fragile. Inside, he built up the fire until warmth filled the single room, then cooked a simple stew of beans and potatoes. He gave her the larger portion without comment and sat across the table, noticing how she hesitated before eating, how her eyes flicked up between each bite, as if testing whether kindness came with a cost. "You can sleep in the bed," he said after they finished. "I'll take the floor." She didn't answer. When he turned to gather blankets, he heard a quick scrape of boots. She had backed into the corner, shoulders pressed to the wall, fear rising fast in her wide eyes. That was when understanding hit him. A man had paid money for her. A man had brought her alone to a cabin miles from town. In her mind, there was only one reason for that. Caleb slowly lowered himself to the floor, keeping distance so he wouldn't tower over her. "Lily," he said gently, "I ain't going to hurt you. Not ever." She studied him like she was measuring truth against everything she'd already survived. "I had a wife once," he went on, voice rough, "and a little boy. Lost him both to fever. After that, it was just me." He swallowed hard. "I didn't buy you for work, and I sure didn't buy you for anything wrong. I bought you because no one else would." Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Then her small voice came, steady but thin. "Are you gonna lock me in the barn?" Caleb blinked. "What?" "Papa did. When I was bad. Said I needed to learn." The word struck like a fist. "No," Caleb said immediately, emotion tightening his throat. "You'll never sleep in a barn here." She twisted her fingers together, building courage for one more question. "Are you gonna sell me again, when I ain't useful no more?" The room seemed to tilt. Caleb felt years of buried grief surge up at once. For his lost son, for the sister he'd once failed to protect, for this child who believed her worth depended on usefulness. He bowed his head, and the tears came hard and unashamed, shoulders shaking as he tried to speak through them. "No," he choked. "Never. You're not for sale. Not now. Not ever." When he finally looked up, she had stepped away from the wall. Not close enough to touch him, but closer. "The bed's really mine?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Every night." She moved toward it slowly, climbing in with her boots still on, curling tight under the quilt like she expected it to vanish. Caleb spread his blanket near the fire and lay down facing the embers, the door barred, the rifle close. Not because he feared her, but because he wanted her safe. After a long time, her breathing softened into sleep. Caleb stared into the fading flames and understood something he hadn't when he handed over $40 in the dirt street. Buying her had been the easy part. Proving she would never be sold again, that would take everything he had. By the time spring rolled across the Texas plains, something inside that little cabin had changed. Lily no longer flinched when Caleb crossed the room. She laughed sometimes, small at first, then freer, as she learned to gather eggs, mend fence wire, and read the sky before a storm. He taught her to fish in the creek behind the barn and how to sit steady in a saddle without fear. He never raised his voice, never raised a hand, and slowly, the haunted look in her eyes began to fade. Trouble came once more from town when a gambler named Vernon Pike claimed Walter had promised the girl to him before Caleb stepped in. But this time Lily did not hide behind anyone. She stood in front of the sheriff and half of Red Hollow and said clear as day, "I ain't property, and he ain't my buyer. He's my father." The words settled over the crowd like truth finally spoken aloud. Papers were signed. Legal guardianship granted. The matter ended not with fists, but with law. That evening, back at the ranch, Lily sat beside Caleb on the porch as the sun melted gold across the prairie. "Why'd you really pay $40? She asked softly. Caleb looked out at the land he had once believed would be his only companion, and then at the girl beside him who had brought life back in his silent rooms. "Because you were worth more than everything I had," he said. She slipped her hand into his, easy and certain. And Caleb Turner, the cowboy who thought his heart had been buried in winter ground years ago, realized he had not bought a child that day in Red Hollow. He had been given a second chance of being a father. In a world that measured value in cattle and cash, $40 had bought nothing at all. But love, freely chosen, had made them both rich.